The first thing Marin Solis noticed was that the man had no appointment. She noticed the second thing a moment later. He smelled like ozone and old copper, the precise smell the air carried after a lightning strike had scorched something close. It was not a smell she associated with the beige waiting room of the Resettlement Grief Services office on Deck 7, where the lighting was engineered to be gentle, and the chairs were upholstered in a muted green that a committee had once decided was calming. She noticed it because she noticed everything. 31 years of practice. Grief counseling aboard a colony ship with 400,000 souls and a travel manifest measured in decades had given her the kind of attention that lived in the body, not the mind. The way a veteran sailor reads the water before the storm shows in the sky. He sat across from her and folded his hands on his knees. His name, he had told the intake system, was Oren, no last name registered. The system had flagged the anomaly, and Marin had cleared the flag herself because she was the senior counselor on this shift. And because she had spent 31 years learning that grief arrived in shapes no form was built to hold. "You've lost someone," she said. Not a question. She never opened with questions. She'd learned long ago that grief didn't respond to interrogation. Oren looked at her. His eyes were a color she would have struggled to name, somewhere between the gray of deep water and the green of copper gone old. He had a face that was difficult to read, not because it was closed, but because it seemed to be doing several things simultaneously. The way a chord was not one note. "I have lost many," he said. His voice was low and even. The accent was strange, not wrong precisely but assembled, as though he had learned human speech from recordings rather than from other humans. "The word you use, loss, it is incomplete. Most words are," Marin said. "That's why people come here." She waited. That was the other thing 31 years had given her. The capacity to let silence sit without rushing to fill it. Most people, she had found, could not bear silence for more than 11 seconds. She had timed it once, as a young counselor, fascinated by the data. 11 seconds, and then people began to talk. Sometimes to say things they hadn't meant to say. Sometimes to say the truest things they knew. Oren sat for 43 seconds without speaking. Marin counted. "I came here," he said finally, "because I was told this was where one came to learn the shape of it." The shape of grief, of endurance. He said the word carefully, as though it were a specimen he was examining. "Your kind endures in a way that does not." He paused. The pause was not hesitation. It was something more deliberate, like a translator selecting between two words of incompatible meaning. "My kind registers it as an error, a malfunction, something to be corrected. You carry it differently." Marin set down her stylus. She had been in this room with people who were barely holding themselves together. People shaking from suppressed crying. People who had lost children, and parents and partners in the accident, 3 years out from New Meridian Station, when a drive coil failed, and 14 people who had been alive in the morning were not alive by evening. She had held the hands of old men who hadn't cried in 40 years and needed someone to tell them it was permissible. She had sat across from teenagers who had no language for what was happening inside them, and had watched them try to build the language in real time, watched them find it, which was one of the most quietly extraordinary things she had ever been allowed to witness. She had never sat across from someone who used the phrase "you're kind." She picked the stylus back up, because she needed something to do with her hands and because she had been in this room long enough to know that you didn't break the thread when it was just beginning to unspool. "Tell me about your kind," she said. His name, he explained, was a designation rather than a name. The closest approximation his language allowed for the human concept of individual identity. His people, the Veth, had no word for loss in the way humans understood it. They had a word for subtraction. They had a word for the recalibration that followed the removal of a variable from a system. They had a word for the period of reduced operational efficiency that sometimes followed a significant recalibration. But they had no word for the sensation of carrying a shape in the chest that was the exact outline of what was gone. No architecture for the idea that an absence could have weight, volume, presence. That the space a person left was not empty, but instead full of the person's shape. "We observed it first during the Calvin engagement," Oren said. "Your soldiers," he stopped himself, corrected, "your people. They had lost more than we anticipated in the first contact. 60% capacity diminished. By any calculation, the engagement should have concluded within the first engagement window." He looked down at his folded hands. Something moved in his face that Marin could not name. "They did not conclude." Marin waited. "They carried the dead," Oren said. "Not the bodies. The presence. They spoke of them." They made decisions with them. One of your soldiers cornered in a collapsed transit corridor with no viable egress and no weaponry that could penetrate our secondary hull plating. Spent 11 of your minutes. 11, we timed it. Telling a dead man that he was sorry. And then she stood up and destroyed our forward sensor array with a piece of conduit pipe. Marin looked at him. We could not model that, Oren said. The apology, the standing up after the apology. We have reviewed the recoursing 6,042 times. The behavior does not resolve. Did you come here to understand it? Marin asked. I came here, Oren said slowly, because I have begun to experience it. The room was very quiet. The ventilation system in the walls breathed its steady rhythm. Somewhere above them, 400,000 people lived their lives. Ate, argued, slept, taught their children how to read, fell in love, grew old, grieved, utterly unaware that there was a Veth sitting in the beige chair across from Marin Solis, looking at his hands as though they were unfamiliar to him. Who did you lose? Marin asked. His answer was not what she expected. He had not lost a person in the human sense. He had lost a collective, a linked awareness of 900 minds that had constituted, in Veth terms, something closer to what humans might call a community, a chorus, a distributed memory. They had been present, and then they had not been present, and the space where they had been was not empty. It was full of their shape. He had no framework for this. His kind registered it as malfunction. He had been directed toward recalibration. He had not been able to recalibrate. He had instead found himself doing something his kind did not do. He had found himself remembering them. Not their data, not their operational parameters, not their combat histories or resource allocations, or the calculations they had contributed to the fleet's navigational matrices. He remembered. He used the word slowly, like someone trying on clothing in an unfamiliar cut. The particular way one mind in the collective had always introduced a small hesitation before committing to a tactical decision. The way another had maintained a warmth in the resonance field that he had not noticed until it was absent. Small things, the ozone smell of them, the texture of their presence in the space they had occupied. That is grief, Marin said quietly. What you're describing is grief. Oren looked at her. The expression on his face was the most complicated thing she had seen in 31 years. And she had seen complicated things. It was not just grief. It was the expression of someone who had come expecting to be given a procedure and had been given instead a mirror. It does not resolve, he said. No, Marin agreed. It doesn't. That's not what it does. He was quiet for a long moment. Among my kind, a thing that does not resolve is a thing that is broken. Among mine, Marin said, a thing that does not resolve is a thing that is real. She watched him absorb that. The process was visible, which surprised her. The Veth, from what she knew, maintained formidable control over their external presentation. Something had cracked in the shell of this one. She thought of the soldier in the collapsed transit corridor, the 11 minutes, the apology, the pipe. She thought about all the ways that humans had always done this. Not resolved, not recalibrated, but carried the weight forward, made decisions from inside the weight, let the weight make them heavier in the ways that made them harder to put down. She thought about her sister, who had died 12 years into the voyage when a fever ran through Deck 14. And Marin had been on the opposite side of the ship, unable to reach her in time. She thought about how she still, sometimes, turned to say something to her sister before she remembered. How the turning had never stopped. How she had stopped expecting it to stop. And how that expectation had itself been a kind of peace. I would like to understand, Oren said, how you continue. You already know how, Marin said. You're doing it right now. You came here. You told a stranger about the 900. You remembered them out loud in a room with someone who was listening. She searched for the word. That's not a procedure. You can't teach it as a procedure. It's the act of insisting that they were real, that they mattered, that the space they left has their shape. Oren was quiet for 30 seconds. 28, 15. Your soldier, he said, in the corridor. We have wondered what she said to the dead man. Marin waited. We have a recording of the acoustic data, but we could not parse the semantic content. The speech patterns were degraded. We analyzed it for tactical information. We found none. He looked at her. What was she saying? I don't know, Marin said honestly, but I can tell you what she probably said. She probably said something she needed him to hear, even though she knew he couldn't hear it. She probably told him something true. People do that. We talk to the dead not because we expect them to answer, but because the talking is how we stay honest about what they meant. Oren was silent. And then she stood up, Marin said. because she had things to do, and she knew he would have wanted her to do them. Something broke very quietly in the space between them. She had seen it before. That moment when the structure a person had built to contain their grief finally admitted that it couldn't contain it. And the grief spilled out and became something less like a damage and more like a dimension. She had never seen it on a non-human face before. She hadn't known it translated. It did. "I do not know," Oren said, his voice still level, but changed in some interior way she felt rather than heard. "What they would have wanted me to do." "Then figure that out," Marin said. "That's the work. That's what we all do. We spend the rest of our lives figuring out what they would have wanted to do, and then we try to do it, and we get it wrong sometimes, and we try again." He sat in the chair for a long time after that. Marin let him sit. She made 2 cups of something warm from the dispenser in the corner, the synthesis that approximated tea without being tea, and she set one on the low table between them in case he wanted it. He didn't touch it, but he looked at it once, briefly, and she thought that might mean something. Outside the port window, the stars were moving. Not actually moving, just slipping in their slow apparent arc as the ship turned through its rotation, but it always looked like moving from inside. Like the universe slowly rearranging itself around the fixed point of wherever you were standing. Marin had worked on this deck for 20 years, and she still stopped sometimes to look at it. "You have been doing this for a long time," Oren said. "Not a question." 31 years, she said. "And you continue. Every day." "It does not," he said carefully, "diminish you." Marin thought about it. The honest answer was the only kind she had ever been able to give in this room. "It changes me," she said. "There's a difference." He stood to go. She felt the shift in the room before she saw the movement. The subtle change in the air's quality that she had learned meant a session was ending. He stood, and he was very tall, and the light from the port window caught the complicated gray-green of his eyes. And she thought about how she would not remember this conversation in the way most people remembered conversations. She would remember it the way she remembered everything that happened in this room. Not the words, exactly, but the shape of what passed between 2 people, trying to put language around something that was slightly too large for language. "I will return," Oren said. It was not phrased as a question or a request. It was stated the way you stated a navigational coordinate, a destination already decided. "I'll be here," Marin said. He stopped at the door. She had seen this too. The pause at the threshold, the thing unsaid that needed to be said. "The 900, he said. "I have begun to make decisions with them." She waited. "In the manner you described, I do not hear their voices." But the assembled accent, was more careful than ever, each word placed with precision. "I find I know what they would want. In certain moments I find the knowing there." "Yes," Marin said. "That's how it works." He left. The door slid closed behind him. The ventilation system breathed its steady rhythm. Outside the port window, the stars continued their slow apparent arc. Marin sat for a moment in the quiet. She thought about the 900. She thought about her sister. She thought about the soldier in the corridor, the 11 minutes, the apology, the conduit pipe, the forward sensor array that was now debris. She thought about what it meant that a being whose kind had spent the better part of 2 decades trying to determine the human capacity for endurance, studying it from the outside, running the numbers, failing to model it, had sat in a beige chair across from her and asked not how to defeat it, but how to do it, how to carry the weight forward, how to let the weight make you harder to put down, how to talk to the dead, not because they could hear you, but because the talking was how you stayed honest about what they meant. She thought that this was perhaps the most human thing she had ever been part of. Not the victory in the corridor, not the sensor array going dark, but this, a being from the far side of the galaxy who had come expecting a malfunction and found instead a dimension, sitting in a beige chair and learning to grieve, learning to be in that specific and irreducible way, changed rather than diminished. She made herself another cup of the tea approximation. She drank it while the stars moved. Then she opened the scheduling system and blocked off an hour the following week, and she entered in the name field a single word, Oren, no last name. The system flagged the anomaly. She cleared the flag. 3 weeks later, a Veth diplomatic attaché sent a formal communiqué to the ship's administrative council requesting access to resettlement grief services. The request cited a need for ongoing consultation regarding what the communiqué termed, in careful diplomatic phrasing, the study of human continuance methodology. The administrative council debated this for 4 days. They sent 3 memos to Captain Yeshadani. Captain Adani forwarded all 3 memos to Maren Solis with a single line appended. Your call. Maren read the communique. She read it carefully. She noted the phrasing, human continuance methodology, and thought about Oren sitting across from her with the weight of 900 in his chest and no word for what it was. She sent back a one-line reply. Send them to Deck 7. The first group arrived on a Tuesday. There were 11 of them, and they smelled like ozone and old copper. And they filed into the waiting room and sat in the green chairs with their hands folded on their knees. And they looked around at the gentle lighting and the calming upholstery. And Maren stood in the doorway between the waiting room and her office and looked back at them. They were grieving, all 11 of them. She could see it. She had 31 years of the kind of attention that lived in the body, not the mind. And she could see it in the way they held themselves, in the too careful stillness that was the opposite of peace, in the copper-gray eyes doing several things simultaneously. They were carrying something with no word for it in their language. And they had come to the people who carried things with no word for it in theirs. Because somewhere in the calculus of survival and loss and the long passage between stars, they had worked out that the humans might know something worth knowing. Maren thought about 31 years. She thought about her sister. She thought about the turning that had never stopped. Come in, she said. She held the door open, and they came.